Okay, so starting with the gastrointestinal system, we're going to begin by looking at the anatomy. So we're going to identify the various tissue layers and major organs that make up the GI system. So what are the structural components as we typically do? We'll start with the structural, um, new terms, new structures, anatomical relationships, and then we'll get into the physiology, and then we will get into the regulation. So starting with an overview of the GI system and processes, we want to think about the main role here as being the absorption of nutrients, digestion first, digestion being breaking them down, absorption of nutrients, and then elimination of waste. So when we consume our large biomolecules, we've talked about things like fats, proteins, carbohydrates, they're usually too large to go directly into the plasma, directly into the bloodstream. And so in order to break them down into smaller components, we undergo digestion first, which happens starting in the mouth and then much more so in the stomach. And then we undergo absorption, which mainly begins in the small intestines. And then we have the elimination of that waste. Now, also happening are motility and secretion. Motility and secretion work hand in hand with digestion and absorption. In order for us to break these biomolecules down into smaller components, we have to effectively move them through the tract, the gastrointestinal tract, and that requires peristalsis. It's the rhythmic movement through contractions of the smooth muscle of the GI tract in order to move those contents through. And then secretion is the release of enzymes, the release of mucus, the release of hormones, acid, etc., in order to help with the various processes, especially with the movement and then with that digestion. So in terms of looking at the tract here, the tract starts in the mouth where we ingest food, water, large biomolecules, goes through the esophagus, which is really just a conduit. There aren't any, major processes happening here other than secretion to lubricate the contents at this point. Then they get into the stomach where digestion really begins. A little bit of carbs can be digested in the mouth, but for the most part, digestion starts in the stomach, especially for proteins and fats. Then we get into the small intestine. Here we have accessory glands like the liver, like the pancreas, the gallbladder, which is really storing that bile. Those are going to release their contents into the small intestine to further help with that digestion and then continue motility. And then the large intestine is really for reabsorption of water, which is really important for our water balance and electrolyte balance, and then solidification of that waste into feces where it can be expelled. So also notice in the background, we have the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system also playing a role, working hand in hand with the GI system here. It's going to be the point where these small nutrients are absorbed across the lumen of the GI tract and into the blood. We also have secretion happening in the opposite direction of large nutrients, um, and of enzymes, etc., that can be released in the opposite direction. And then those nutrients are going to be circulated in the blood and make their way to various cells um, at different capillary beds, and then they can be exchanged across different capillary beds to nourish various tissues. Now we can divide the GI system into different parts. We can think about the tract itself, which is sometimes called the alimentary canal or the alimentary tract. That is separate from the accessory tissues and accessory glands. So the tract itself starts at the mouth. It's a hollow tube, has a lumen that is variable in different parts, about 15 feet long from the start to the finish, starting with the mouth, then the pharynx, then the esophagus, again, that conduit between the oral cavity and the stomach. Then we have the stomach itself, lots of acid here to really begin that digestion. Then we have the intestines, which can be divided into small intestines, large intestines. The small intestines have three parts that we'll speak about, the jejunum, the duodenum, the ileum, and their main role is absorption. And then the large intestine is otherwise known as the colon. So the large intestine is beginning at the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and then finally ending in the rectum and then the anus. So that is the entirety of the alimentary tract or the GI tract. This is where food is moving through as all of these various processes take place. The other major division are the accessory glands. So these are glands that are not a part of the tract, but they do release their secretions, fluids, mucus, enzymes into the lumen of the GI tract to further help the processes, both digestive and absorptive, that are happening throughout the length of the tract itself. Okay, this is a schematic as we get into the layers of the GI tract. We'll talk about each of the layers, how they differ, but just starting with an overview of how they are compared to each other. So here's the lumen of this hollow tube, the GI tract. And then here's the outer layers that make up the wall of this tract. First off, from the innermost aspect, we want to start with the mucosa. And the mucosa is comprised of three smaller layers that are the first structures that nutrients must pass through in order to be absorbed. So this is starting with the epithelia. And the epithelia are essentially cells that are stacked against each other to create this epithelial lining. This will differ in different parts of the tract, but for the most part, it's columnar cells. Columnar cells that are tall, have the ability to absorb and secrete, and can help with those digestive and absorptive processes. Then we have the lamina propria, and lamina propria is the underlying connective tissue. It also supplies the epithelia and nourishes the epithelia. Epithelia itself is avascular. It doesn't have its own blood supply. And so if you look at the lamina propria, it has these small blood vessels, small nerve endings that can actually feed the overlying epithelium and keep it sustained. And so this is also secreting um, some of the glandular secretions that help with motility and secretion as well. The third layer of the mucosa is the muscularis mucosae. It is a smooth muscle layer, very, very thin, smooth muscle layer that helps with the movement of the secretions, that helps with the inner epithelial layer and really helps to secrete those secretions into the lumen. That smooth muscle layer is different than the muscularis externa. Muscularis externa, its main role is for the emulsion, right? The peristalsis, the overall rhythmic movement of the GI tract itself, while the muscularis mucosa is really the movement that is allowing the secretion and the movement of substances across the GI wall, as opposed to the entire peristalsis. So that is the mucosa with its three parts. Next, we have the submucosa, and the submucosa is right underneath the mucosa. It is comprised of larger blood vessels, larger nerves, and the submucosal plexus of nerves called the Meissner's plexus. And then finally, the third, and not finally, but the third thickest layer is going to be the muscularis externa. This is a much thicker, smooth muscle layer. It has its own plexus called the Auerbach's plexus, sometimes called the myenteric plexus. And this is the plexus that actually moves the GI tract layer. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, the inner layer, the submucosa, the nerves here, such as the Meissner's plexus, that innervates the glands that are responsible for secretion. The Auerbach's plexus innervates the smooth muscle that is responsible for the peristaltic movement of the GI lumen. All right, so two different layers of nerves and muscle that have slightly different functions. Lastly, the serosa. The serosa is the outermost layer. It is either connective tissue or serous tissue. And that'll make a little bit more sense as we go on to describe exactly what the serosa is. So the serosa can be different in different areas. When we're looking at parts of the lumen or parts of the tract, like the stomach, like the small intestines, it's going to be covered by a serous layer, very thin layer that actually makes serous fluid. Whereas in lower and upper parts of the tract, like the esophagus or even the rectum and anus, it's covered by connective tissue, which are located in those different parts, right? The pharynx, the thorax, or even the pelvis. So it can be either serosa or connective tissue. All right, let's go on to describe those layers, describe those different components in much more detail, and add on their functional aspects, right? What are the roles of these different structures, these different layers of the tract? So we have the mucosa, which is the lining surface of the lumen. We have the submucosa, which is the outer surface. So the submucosa has its own submucosal plexus, it has nerves, it has larger arteries. Then we have the muscularis externa, which is the smooth muscle layer, this thick, smooth muscle tissue layer that is really important for peristalsis. And then we have the outer serosa. So the serosa or the connective tissue adventitia is going to be the outermost covering that is adhered to the body wall or the outer anatomical structures, depending on what part of the lumen we're looking at. Let's look more closely at the mucosa. This is what separates the lumen from the body's internal environment and basically external versus internal environment where absorption and secretion take place across this epithelia. It has cells like enterocytes. Enterocytes are cells that can either be absorptive or they can have an exocrine function, releasing their secretions into ducts or releasing their secretions into the blood, having more of an endocrine function. So different types of enterocytes can be seen at different parts of the GI tract. The three layers that make up the mucosa, as we mentioned earlier, are the epithelial lining, which is mainly columnar cells, this very thin layer of cells, the lamina propria, which is the underlying supportive connective tissue of the epithelia, and the muscularis mucosae, which is a very thin, smooth muscle layer that is found within the mucosa. Let's talk about the lamina propria a bit more. So the lamina propria is connective tissue. It has the blood vessels, the lymphatics, the nerves. It also has some lymphoid tissues like the lymphatic nodules and the Peyer's patches. So Peyer's patches are specifically found in the small intestines. But these lymphatic nodules are playing a role that is similar to the tonsils. Notice how the tonsils can surveil the oral cavity for any pathogens, bacteria, or any type of foreign substances that are entering the oral cavity. And so these lymphatic nodules and tissues play a similar role in the submucosa of the GI tract. And they're part of the lamina propria, which is going to be deep to the mucosa. And then the third layer of the mucosa is the muscularis mucosae, and this is a thin layer of smooth muscle. Again, it has longitudinal fibers, so you know the striations, not striations rather, but the orientation of those fibers is longitudinal. We'll talk about the muscularis externa, which has fibers arranged in different rows. So we're going to see a very thin layer here of longitudinal fibers and circular fibers that help to mix the luminal contents, right? The luminal contents are passing through, and so having smooth muscle fibers in different orientations is what allows for peristalsis, right? We can have the lumen change in size and then the lumen change in length in order to move those contents along. Next, we get to the submucosa. This is another thick layer of connective tissue. It is much more distendable, has much more elasticity. It also has larger blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves than we see in the lamina propria, which is a part of the mucosa. This also has the submucosal plexus, the Meissner's plexus. You can see that network of nerve that is running on the submucosa, and that is a part of the enteric nervous system that is going to be found in the submucosa. And then thirdly, the muscularis externa. This has an inner circular, which changes the diameter, and outer longitudinal, which changes the length, right? This again works together to allow for the rhythmic peristalsis that moves the food contents along the lumen. And then the network of nerves here is called the myenteric plexus or the Auerbach's plexus, which is another part of the enteric nervous system. Enteric just means that it's kind of it's like the nervous system of the gut, right? It's like the brain of the gut. It's the plexus of nerves that receive instructions from the autonomic nervous system and that help to control various aspects of motility, of secretion that happens throughout the entire GI tract. So it's like the brain of the gut. And then the serosa here is going to be connective tissue and then an outer epithelial layer called mesothelium. This is what we describe as being that serosa, which is going to be continuous with the peritoneum. Now, this is only found in areas that have a peritoneal covering. Parts like the esophagus and the lower areas like the rectum and anus do not have serosa. They have just what is called an adventitia, which is a thicker connective tissue, but the inner sort of visceral parts of the tract, the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, they have a thinner mesothelial layer that is continuous with the peritoneum that we describe as being serosa. All right, let me pause here for any questions. Let's talk about the functional anatomy of each of these regions. So we'll go over each part of the tract from the mouth all the way down to the rectum and anus and talk about their functional importance. Okay, starting with the mouth. So the mouth is where digestion begins, and this is especially true for carbohydrates. There's a special type of amylase in the saliva that begins the breakdown of starch. This process is called mastication or chewing, where the food is crushed up, ground up, it's mixed with saliva. Saliva helps to increase the lubrication. It's also going to have that salivary amylase, which begins the breakdown of more complex starches like glycogen and so forth. And this all happens as we mulch and mix and chew that bolus of food up, and it begins to liquefy and move through the rest of the esophagus, right? The upper gastrointestinal tract. Then it passes through the pharynx or the throat. This is a common shared passageway for both air and food. They are separated by the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is what covers over the larynx and protects any food particles from entering the trachea, whereas that bolus of food can pass behind in the pharynx and then make its way past the upper esophageal sphincter and into the esophagus itself. Now, looking more closely at the esophagus, it is a hollow muscular tube connecting the pharynx and the stomach. The upper 1/3 is skeletal muscle, the lower 1/3 is smooth muscle, and then the middle third is a mix. It's a gradual progression of skeletal muscle, which is voluntarily controlled, to smooth muscle, which is not. And so if you think about the coughing, not coughing, but more so the gag reflex, parts of the swallowing or deglutition are going to involve the upper esophageal sphincter, which is comprised of skeletal muscle, which we can voluntarily control. If we think about the lower esophageal sphincter, this is the junction between the lower third of the esophagus, which is smooth muscle, and the opening or entrance into the stomach. And that is going to be guarded by smooth muscle instead of skeletal muscle, which means that we do not voluntarily control that. And that can lead to things like gastroesophageal reflux disease, where acid can reflux past that sphincter and begin to move into the esophagus and cause things like heartburn. So just thinking about the types of muscle found in both parts of the esophagus, the upper sphincter versus the lower sphincter, can help us understand some of the pathology that we see in these two parts